Hi, this is Jeff Daniels, and welcome to another edition of MasterVisualStudio.net. Today we'll be looking at adding and customizing Identity 2.0 to an existing ASP.NET Core MVC web application. Along the way, we'll show you how to configure Identity to use integer values for the key column, and also add some custom fields to be tracked with your users. If this is something you need to do, tune in. We'll have you up and running in no time with a custom Identity implementation. Alright, so let's get started. What I'm going to do to start with is just create an empty ASP.NET Core web application that does not have Identity, and then we'll go through the process of adding it in and customizing Identity. In this case, we're going to switch the primary key for the Identity column to be an integer rather than a GUID. And the second thing we'll do is add a couple custom fields to our Identity table, first and last name in this case. So let's get started. We're going to go in and say, let's call this my test app. So once we've got our test application set up, now when the next window comes up, we're going to start with an MVC controller just so we have some pages to work with that we can add authentication to. So we'll assume you already have an existing ASP.NET Core web app, or you're creating a new one, but you'll handle some of that infrastructure, and I'll show you how to set that up as we go through this anyways. We'll turn off HTTPS just for this example. You can see I've got no authentication for this app. So once this application comes up, one of the first things we need to do is tell Identity where this information is going to be stored. And we're going to do that by going to the appsettings.json file, and we're going to add a new connection string section here. So we'll go in and add connection strings. And when we're setting these up, I assume you're going to have a local SQL server or a database connection that you can use. In this case, I'm going to use just a trusted connection to a local SQL server database that I've got here. So we're going to want to give a key to our connection. So in this case, I'll just call it app data. And then we'll create our data source connection string. So the data source will be just on my local here, which is JD Surface Book, and it's a named instance. So in this case, the instance is going to be called SQL 2017. So that gives us that, and then we'll pick an initial catalog, and I'll show you the database here real quick that we have set up just to start with. So if I jump over to SSMS here, you can see I've got my test database is the name of the database, and I've got one table over there that's called customer, just as a holding place right now. So my test DB, and then we're going to want to just use, in my case, I'm going to use trusted connection equals true. You're likely going to have some kind of connection string that you're going to want to use based on an application user or whatever that criteria is. But in my case, we're going to keep it simple. So there's my connection string. Now the next piece that we're going to want to add is the classes that will subclass off of Identity. So essentially what you get with Identity is an Identity user class, an Identity role class, a database context class that it will use to connect and create the tables for you and retrieve the data. So in this case, because we want to change Identity a little bit, we want to say the primary key is now going to be an integer rather than a GUID, and we want to add a couple custom properties to our Identity. I want to know the first and last name of who's logging in. So we'll go through the steps real quick of setting up those. So if we go into our models folder that was created, we're just going to go ahead and add a class. So there's three classes we're going to have to set up here. The first one's going to be a custom roles class, second one's going to be a custom user class, and the third one's going to be the Entity Framework's database context that we'll use to manage that. So let's start with our custom role class, and I'm just going to call mine app role. Very simple class here. All we really need to do is just subclass this from identity role, and I'm going to do control dot, which is going to bring up the ability. It's just this, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Essentially, we're just going to bring in that namespace for ASP.NET Core Identity. And the other piece we want to do here is, because we're changing the identity column from being a GUID to an int, we do need to tell the subclass that that's going to be the case. So great, that's all we need to do for that class. Next one we're going to do is our identity user class. So we're going to call that app user. again, really simple stuff here for the identity user. All we need to do with this guy is inherit, or he'll subclass the identity user, pull that namespace in again with control period, and again this is going to be an int. And in this case, like I said, we're going to not only change the primary key, but we're going to add a custom property or two that will automatically be able to store to the database once these tables get generated. So we'll make a public string for first name, the getter and setter, and a public string for last name, again with a getter and setter. Great, so now those are done, and now we'll just make our database context class. So in this case, we're going to want to call this, something. In this case, I'm just going to call it identity app context. And this class is going to be a subclass of identity db context. And again, let's bring in that namespace from Entity Framework Core. And here's where we provide the custom classes that we've created. So the user class that we want this to manage is AppUser. The role class that we want is AppRole. And again, we're going to tell it that the primary key for our class is going to be an integer. And then we're going to set up a basic constructor for this to pass on the configuration information. So go ahead and create a constructor for your app context class. And in this case, it's going to be passed in a db context options object that will be for your app context as a generic type. And that is we'll just call that options. And all we want to do with that options object is just pass it through to our base object that we inherited from. So there you go. And obviously bring in this namespace from Entity Framework Core. So now we've got the three subclasses that we needed to set, the three classes we needed to set up in order to have Entity Framework generate our identity classes and tables for us. So now that we've got that, we're going to jump over to the startup.cs, and once over there, we'll have to configure some services and get that set up. So let's jump over there next. Okay, so we're inside the startup.cs class, and first thing we want to do is start up here on configure services. So in configure services, there's two things we need to do. First, we need to go ahead and set up identity, and then we need to configure it to use our DB context that we just created. So let's start with setting up identity. So we'll go to services.add identity. And here we're going to pass in the custom classes that we've created. Again, so we've got the app user and the app role. Let's, if I could type that correctly. Then we're just going to bring in those namespaces. And we're going to use in this case, I'm just going to show you a real quick kind of configuration option we've got here. So we would do that, pass in options to be able to configure it. And in this case, we would want to be able to say that our options for the user, let's require a unique email. Make that true. And once we do that, let's go add Entity Framework Stores. And we have to bring in that namespace also. Oh, actually, we want to tell it to use where it's going to be stored, which is our identity app context. Great. No errors, so far so good. And the next thing we want to do is be able to set up our database context with our connection string. So we'll go in and use services again, add a DB context. We'll tell it to use our custom database context that we've created. And again, that's going to be passed in a configuration object. And what we want to do here is tell it to use SQL Server with our connection string that we set up in the appsettings.json file. So we'll want to say use SQL Server. And we want to bring that in from the Entity Framework namespace. So there we go, use SQL Server. And we'll pass in, it's going to want a connection string. So we use the configuration object, which if you're not familiar, this configuration object we receive from dependency injection being passed in on the constructor up here. So we're just going to use that and call get connection string, which will go read that app settings.json file that we had set up. And the name of that connection string that we want is app data. Close off with some semicolons, and that's all we need to do in configure services. The next piece we'll do is down below here in configure. Now you can see here we've got use static files and cookie policy MVC. So right before this MVC, let's go in and just after one keynote is do this after static files. So a little bit below that, here we've got app.use authentication. And there we go. So now we've gone in and configured the startup.cs. We've got our custom classes. So all of those pieces are together. Now what we want to do is generate the tables on the database. So let's go ahead and do a build just to make sure we're at a good spot. And this should be wrapped up in just a second. And once it is, now let's go ahead, if we jump back over and you take a look at the test database, we've got the customer table is the only one over there, right? So that's all that we have. So these next steps are going to actually generate these tables that we've asked for identity, along with our custom field changes that we added. So we're going to jump down to Package Manager Console. And if you don't have it open, you can go to Tools, and then Package Manager Console. Manager, NuGet Manager, Package Manager Console. I've already got it open down here. So the first thing we want to do is create a migration to kind of set the baseline for where Entity Framework's going to create our data from, our tables. So we'll go in and we'll say add migration, and we'll just call it create identity schema. Now, this will go through, grab the Entity Framework classes that we've subclassed and start to create a migration up here that you can see. You can see it's created this migration up here, which will take us to the baseline, and then what we're going to actually do is push that out to the database. So if I go back to Package Manager Console, and I just say update database, and I'll do verbose just so we can see all the work that it does. Now keep in mind, if you run this and you start to see errors, one of the causes that I've run into was just a typing error. So if it's trying to go out to get your app settings JSON table name, like there you go. This is a perfect example. So keyword not supported. Well, what's going on with that? If I go over to my app settings class, and let's see, usually it's just that I've spelled something wrong. So let's take a look to see if I can figure out what's going on with that. If I go to this guy where it says trusted connection, right? So that's not the one I wanted. I actually wanted integrated security. So it's totally different. There you go. Integrated security. So now we save that. We'll come back here, run this again. Like I said, I've done everything from forget the named instance at the end of the server name to the typing in the wrong name of the initial catalog. All those types of things will give you those, could be sometimes a little obscure errors. So that's the first thing to go back and check to make sure your connection string is good. Now in this case, you can see it looks like it's finished the migration and generated our tables. So if I right click on tables and click refresh, you'll see I've got all my ASP.NET identity tables here now. Now granted, there's nothing in here. So empty table. However, if you look here, you can see I've got my first name and last name. So my custom properties did get added, and if I look at my primary key, it is an integer. So everything's working as we expected so far. So the next step we're going to look at is going to be how do we set up some views so we can start to use this new identity model, the new identity models that we have. Okay, for this next step, we're going to go through and start to set up a new controller that's going to manage our identity models and the login. So we'll go to the controller folder and click add new controller. We're going to do an empty MVC controller. And we're going to call this account. So once this generates, I'm going to save you guys the painfulness of having to watch me type all this in. I'll paste it in, but then we'll talk through it so that it's all really clear as far as what we're doing. Now, there's two classes that once we have our class, the account controller, that we'll want to inject into that using dependency injection from the identity framework. There we go. So we've got our account controller, and I just fast forwarded through some of that so you wouldn't have to sit there painfully and watch that. Now we've got this new controller. We're not going to use this index action on this controller, but what we are going to need to do is bring in a couple classes using dependency injection so that we can work with our identity classes. And the first one is user manager. So our account controller's got a new constructor. We're going to ask for a user manager that's using the AppUser class, and we're going to set that into a parameter here for user manager, and then we're also going to ask for sign-in manager that's going to be working with the AppUser class, and we'll set that into this parameter. And then both of these we're going to, you'll see here, we'll just store those to private properties on the controller. So let's go ahead and bring in these namespaces. First we'll bring in the user manager. Or actually it brought in the app user first when I did that. Now we'll bring in the user manager. So now those are in. Okay, that all looks good. So now that we've got access to the user manager and the sign-in manager, the first method that we'll create here on this will be our register method. So that we can actually register and get a new record into our database. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to create a public async action result called register. And I've got a little bit of try catch in here, but it's a pretty straightforward thing. So we're going to add a message about whether or not the user was already registered. We'll default it to that we found the user. And then we're going to go out and try to get the user called test user from user manager. Now keep in mind, this is going to be using this app user class that we created. It'll pull the connection string from the app settings.json class. So all this is now going to start working together. It's going to go out and try to find a user in our database called test user. So when it goes out to get that, we'll come back, and if we did not find it, then we'll just go ahead and create one, just so we can walk through that process. It's going to create a new app user, set the username, the email, and the first and last name, and then it'll create our user for us. And we're just going to set it to test123 exclamation point as the password, just so we can get a user in the system that we can then try logging in with. The viewBag message will say it was created, and if there's any errors, we'll give that message back here too. And then we'll just return this view. So the next step would be to create this view, and it'll just be called register. And really very simple view here that we're going to put together just so that we can see the information coming back. We're just going to output the message, and then we'll give a link to log in using that information that we just added for the user. So we'll save that. And now I want to go to the two pages. First I want to go to the layout page that you'll have in your project, just so I can put a way for us to get to these. And I'm just going to add one more menu option here. So it had the default project came with home, about, and contact. I'm going to add in, if they're authenticated, then show the log out for the current user, and if they're not authenticated already, just give them the login link. And then the second thing I'm going to add is, if we go over to the index view for the home index that was generated when I created the new project, I'm essentially just going to get rid of all this and just put a link to register. Okay, so if we've got that, and we'll just build all this. So at this point, we should be able to go into the application, click on the register. It'll call the register page over here. It'll try to find the test user, which doesn't exist in the database. It'll add the new user, give us the message, and then we'll have our first record into the database using identity. So if we want to test that out, go ahead and run the project. And once that comes up, we'll just pull that over here. And you can see we've got our test project running on this port, and there's our test app. And we've got our login because we're not yet authenticated. We also have this register link. So when I click on this, what we should see happen is it call the controller, try to find the user, not find it, and then add it to our database. So if we go over to SQL, we'll see right now we don't have anyone in there. And once we come back here and we click on register, user was created. Great. So if we jump back over and we run this, you'll see now we've got our test user. It was able to save our first name and last name, our custom properties, and obviously get a ID using identity as an identity column in the database of 1, because that's our first user. So the next thing we'll do is go back over to our test app. And now we want to add the ability to log in using that user account that we had just set up. So we'll grab the code for that, go back to our account controller. So now that we'll just try to run this in here. And we have to stop debugging, obviously. So the login is going to go in, use the sign-in manager, try to do a password sign-in for the test user using the password that we've supplied. And if it succeeds, it will redirect back over to the index page. If it does not succeed, then we'll get the result is, and then whatever it is, back to this view. So for starters, we'll go ahead and create, maybe put the wrong password in here. Now after we've created this login method, we still need to add the view. So we'll do that. And very simple bit of content in here. All we're going to want to do is just show the result. And we're really only going to see this result if the login fails. So now we've got that. We've got the index view updated, the register, the layout. So now all this functionality should really be tied together, and we should be able to do everything within the application. The user's registered, should be able to log in, and I think the only thing we haven't added yet was log out, so we'll add that next. Just verify that this works. So we can see if we log in, we'll see we had the wrong password, so the result is that it did not work. And good, so we saw that we got that message. And if we go over here, we'll just fix that. And while we're in here, let's go ahead and add the logout. So we'll have that functionality also. Which all this is going to do is use a signing manager to sign us out and then redirect us back over to the index.home page. So fingers crossed, at this point we should be able to have a registered user logging in, logging out, and this should all be wrapped up. Alright, so once this page comes up, you'll see that we're not logged in. There we go. And if we try to register, we'll see that the user is already registered. So it did not recreate the user. And then if we go to log in, you can see we're logged in as test user. And if we log out, great, we're now logged out of the application. So we took a website that didn't have any authentication and added in our own custom implementation of identity. My name is Jeff Daniels. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully you found this to be helpful. If so, we've got more content on the way, including combining JWT tokens and identity to secure your web API, along with a host of Angular content. So stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next episode of MasterVisualStudio.net.